Okay, so we continue to work through the Sermon on the Mount, and we are in chapter 6 this morning. We're beginning a new chapter. And just a little bit of a recall of what we've covered in the sermon so far. And if you look at the sermon critically, Jesus, and of course, is a brilliant teacher. And the way that he organizes and structures this sermon has a glimpse of the divine in it because there's so much genius in it. And there's an introduction, and that's the Beatitudes. And we spent quite a time working through the Beatitudes. And then there's the body of the sermon itself. And there's three parts to that body of the sermon. We covered the first part so far in the second half of Matthew chapter 5. And that's where he introduces them by talking about the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. And then he talks about how that law should lead to a greater form of righteousness, greater even than those who were teaching them the law. And then he gives 6 examples from the law itself, from Torah, and explains to them what God's heart behind the law was and how they should be able to see that and apply it. We're working into the second part of the body of the sermon now, and this is also dealing with a greater form of righteousness, an alignment of our heart with God's. But where that first part dealt with interpreting the law, the second part deals with how we apply righteousness in our lives. And he's going to focus in on 3 really common forms of religious practice at the time, those being giving of alms, giving to the poor, prayer, and fasting. And like he did with these 6 examples prior, he's going to take examples. He's going to say, this is how we put our righteousness into practice in a way that brings about a greater form of righteousness. And these 3 examples that he picks, giving, prayer, fasting, these are all very common, essential parts of Jewish life at the time. This is what it looked like to live out their righteousness in practice. Maybe some equivalents today, if you were to ask the modern Christian, what are the 3 big things you have to do on a daily basis? What might be some of those things? You might say, well, prayer would be one of them. You need to read your Bible all the time, and you need to go to church, right? Those are the 3 things you got to do. So Jesus is taking those examples, and he's saying, this is what it looks like to apply them. Practical application. So this is what he says, beginning in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, and this serves as an introduction then to these 3 examples that follow. He says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others in order to be seen by them. Because if you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Beware not to practice your righteousness in front of other people in order to be seen by them, because if you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. And it's interesting, he introduces this idea of reward, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But what I want you to pay special attention to and understand here is that Jesus is not forbidding public acts of piety. In other words, he's not saying, don't you ever practice your righteousness in front of people, because that would be impossible. We're supposed to, what did he get done saying in Matthew chapter 5? We are a what unto the world? A light unto the world, right? We're supposed to put our righteousness on display in a way that brings other people to God. So he's not saying do everything in secret. He's saying, what is he saying? He's saying don't do these things in such a way that it brings more attention to you than it does to God. What he's really doing is he's calling into question our motives. And he's asking us to question our own motives in the way that we practice our righteousness. And another thing I want to point out here, which is important, is Jesus does not say, I need you to be on the lookout for when other people get this wrong. That's not what he's saying. That's what we love to do. We love to be righteousness police, and we love to call into question other people's motives as they put their righteousness into practice. That's not what he's calling his disciples to do right now. He's asking us to be introspective, and he says, you call your own motives into question. Beware when you put your righteousness into practice. Who is your audience, and what is your motivation behind it? There's a difference between the reward we might receive from others. If this is what we're doing, if we're putting our righteousness into practice so that other people might see us and compliment us on our righteousness, there's a vast difference between that reward and the reward that we expect to receive from the Father. And that's what he's trying to get us to think about. He does something interesting when he gets through these three examples of prayer and fasting, and the first one here, giving of alms. 3 times in verse 2, in verse 5, and verse 16, in all of these examples, he says exactly the same thing. He says, truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. If this is the reward you're after, recognition from the people around you, then you've already received it. But there's a contrast between that and what we have yet to receive, a reward from the Father. One other thing I think Jesus is trying to get us to think about here, and I want you to contemplate this. Following Jesus will not often result in receiving public recognition for your faithfulness. In other words, Jesus is calling us to a radical way of living. Discipleship, following Christ, truly following Christ, will more often than not result in not praise from the world, but what? A rejection from the world. This is why, again, in the previous chapter, he's talking about how they're to respond when people do what? Persecute them. Because this is what you can expect to receive from the world around you. Jesus is not calling us to fit in culturally. He's calling us to step into a life that is very countercultural. This is what discipleship looks like. And so more often than not, if you're doing what Christ is calling you to do, you're not going to expect to receive praise from the people around you. They're not going to praise you. They're going to do the opposite. But if our heart's desire is to do the will of the Father, and if our heart's desire is to be recognized not by people, but by Him for the work that we're putting into the kingdom, then we have to be okay with leaving our desire for human recognition behind. What are we really after? Recognition from people or recognition from our Father? Those are two different goals. Those are two different motivations. Those are two different audiences. And Christ is asking us to call into question our own motives behind the way that we pursue our righteousness. And so with that in mind, I want you to think about this passage. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 4, and I think this passage serves as a great example of what this looks like lived out. This is the Apostle Paul, and he's talking about, this is actually a passage where he's dealing with those who are very critical of his apostleship and what his authority might have looked like. And addressing that head on, he says, this then is how you ought to regard us. In other words, Paul and the other apostles who had labored so much in the kingdom. He said, regard us as servants of Christ and of those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed. Now it's required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. I take Paul at his word when he says that. But are you able to say that same thing and mean it? I care very little if I am judged by other people. It's a difficult place to get to in life where you can truly say that. I really don't care what esteem other people have for me. Because most of us are motivated by that. We're motivated by the likes. We're motivated by the attention we get. What we care most about is how other people regard us. But Paul says that's not my primary concern. He says, I don't even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose, what does he say? The motives of the heart. Only God can see into here and judge what our true motivation is behind the acts of righteousness that we put on display. And he says at that time, each will receive, this is the reward, their praise from God the Father. Not from others, but from God the Father. Another passage in Romans, again from Paul, he says this. He says, a person is not a Jew who is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but it is from God. It's interesting because Jesus devotes 3 examples to us wrapping our head around this principle. Clearly, he thinks this is incredibly important, that we learn how to judge our own motives rightly. But I don't know that we spend a whole lot of time thinking about this in the modern church. And this is something I think we would do well over the next few weeks to really force ourselves to come to terms with. Part of this is because I think in the modern church, if we are critical for just a moment and honest as we evaluate what the modern Western church looks like, what is the focus of this very room that we're in right now? It's what? It's a stage that I'm standing on. And all of our attention is paid to whoever it is on the stage leading that particular part of worship. And what do? We praise the song leader if he does a good job, or we complain about him on the ride home if he doesn't. We thank the preacher at the door if he kept our attention, or we walk by rapidly with our eyes on the ground if he didn't. We're so used to thinking about worship as a public-facing, borderline form of performative righteousness that I think we really struggle to be critical, because we've actually built a system that encourages this in a lot of ways. I know some of you get frustrated with me because I'm not very good at taking a compliment. And it's true, I'm not. But the reason behind that is, it's not that I don't appreciate compliments. It's that I appreciate them too much. And I'm aware of that. And I'm aware of the fact that I might preach a sermon, stand at the door, and every one of you might line up to tell me, "Great job today, preacher." And yet the sermon might have been terrible. It could have been terrible. This is the problem. That we're not always excellent judges of what's good and what's not. And if I'm seeking the approval of people, and if I'm seeking for praise that comes from any way that I might perform my faith in front of other people, then that will be the only reward I receive. But honestly, it's a pretty lousy reward. I think about one of the greatest sermons ever preached. Acts chapter 7. Who preached that sermon? Do you remember? Who was it? Stephen. How many people lined up at the end of that sermon to shake his hand and tell him good job? If you don't know that story, read chapter 7 and into chapter 8. This is at the heart of what we struggle with, I think, as modern Christians. We are almost trained in a lot of ways to be performative in our righteousness. And Jesus is saying, slow down and question your own motives. Who are you desiring praise from? People around you or your Father? And that's at the heart of all three of these examples that he's going to get into. And he does something interesting here in Matthew chapter 6, later on, about halfway through. It seems like he's changing the subject and getting into how we deal with wealth and other privilege, and we'll talk about that. And he is transitioning, but I think he's also looking back on what he just got done saying, and he says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And he segues into a conversation about our relationship with wealth. But looking back on what he just got done saying, this also has a lot to do with what we're talking about this morning, with where our treasure lies. You've got a choice. Your reward can come in the form of people telling you, man, you are so righteousness, how impressive. Or it can come in the form of what God has to say to you because of what you've done in private. And what Jesus is calling us to is, don't store up for yourselves the kind of treasures that come from the lips of man. Store up for yourself the treasure that comes from God the Father. Those words that we all long for him to say, which is what? Well done, good and faithful servant. You might tell me that, but I want to hear that from my Father. That's the motive in here, and that's what Jesus is trying to get us to think about. So, he gets into the first example, and this is about the giving of alms. And real quick, before we get into this, often when we hear the term giving used in the modern church, again, we think of what? What we just did at the end of the Lord's Supper, right? Where we offer our contribution. And there's kind of a parallel there, but what he's addressing specifically is not contribution that gets divvied up among all kinds of things. Jason talked a couple weeks ago about all the ways our money gets spent on renovating this property, on upkeeping this property, on utility bills, on my salary, on all kinds of things. But this is a specific kind of giving that was aimed at caring for the poor. One kind of giving for one purpose, giving to the poor. We live in a world where thankfully there's a lot of social infrastructure in place to make sure that people have what they need when they are in need. This was that social infrastructure at the time. And the synagogues took it upon themselves to take up these collections and then disperse it among those who were in need. And it was a very important part of how the Jewish people expressed their righteousness. So this is a good example for Jesus to give of what this looks like in practical application. So he says, so when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets. Now, hold on for a second, because if you're picturing, first century Jerusalem and Jewish people walking around Jerusalem literally blasting trumpets before they give their contribution, that's not what's going on. Jesus is using imaginative language in order to make a point. And again, the master teacher is so good at tapping into hyperbole in order to trigger our imaginations, right? Because we picture something ridiculous. Someone about to drop their offering in the plate and they blast a trumpet beforehand to show everyone what they're about to do. They weren't literally doing that. But the idea is, if you just want people to see what you're about to give, hold your horses. Do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do. We'll get back to that word in just a minute. As the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the street, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. We need to look at a few passages here because they're important. The first is Deuteronomy chapter 15. I want you to see what Torah says about giving to the poor. Deuteronomy chapter 15, I'm going to begin in verse 7. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites, in any of the towns of the land of the Lord your God is giving to you, do not be, and I love the language that's used here, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The seventh year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will towards the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in your land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. A couple terms jump out at you that we talk about in the church, right? You hear Paul's words about encouraging us that we need to be generous, and God loves what kind of giver? A cheerful giver. That this is a willing offering, not begrudgingly. We're not tight-fisted. We're open-handed with our generosity when those who are truly in need. And then that statement at the end, there will always be poor people in the land. What did Jesus say? You will always have the poor among you. And what do we do with that? We say, oh, Jesus dismissed the poor. See, they're always going to be here, therefore don't pay attention. No, the opposite of that. There will always be need, therefore meet the need as you can. This is embedded in the heart of the Torah. But there's a couple proverbs that I think really challenge us. The first is Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 31. Listen to this one. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker. There was this idea that if you want to know how a person really feels about their God, watch how they treat the poor. Whoever is kindly to the needy honors God. You cannot say, I love my God, if you do not love your brother or sister in need. That's the point. Then another proverb, this time in chapter 19, verse 17. Whoever is kind to the poor, listen to this one, lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Who are you actually giving that money to? And this sounds a whole lot like what? Like Matthew 25. When Jesus is talking about those who helped those who were sick or naked or hungry or thirsty or in prison. And they responded, we didn't see you any of those ways, Lord. And he said, no, but as much as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. That's not a brand new idea. That's here. When you lend money to the poor, who are you actually giving to? You're giving to God. And where will your reward come from? Not from any thanks you might receive from them, but from the interest you're building up with God. So allow those things to challenge us when it comes to our giving. But here's the problem. Jesus is challenging us not to be hypocritical in the way that we approach our giving. Now, we use that term a lot, and we use it a lot in religious settings. Talk about hypocrites all the time, and I think a lot of us, our biggest fear is that we might be found to be hypocrites when it comes to our faith. And a lot of times when we use that term, we think of people who say what to do but don't do it. And that's certainly one way you can use that term, but in this setting, that's not what he has in mind, because these aren't people who are telling everyone else to give but not giving themselves. Jesus is addressing people who are generous. They're being generous with their money. They are giving alms. He says, when you give alms, he's taking for granted the fact that they are engaged in this form of religious action. The problem was the motivation behind it. Now, that word hypocrite, Jesus uses it frequently, but especially in Matthew chapter 23 when he's taking aim at the scribes and the Pharisees. And I don't know that he has them particularly in mind here in the Sermon on the Mount, but this is very applicable because what he's addressing in this passage is exactly what he's addressing here. So look at Matthew chapter 23, if you would. Matthew chapter 23, beginning of verse 1. It says, and Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They occupy positions of authority. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you to do, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. That's typically what we think about when we think about a hypocrite, right? But there's something more. He goes on in verse 5. Everything they do is done for what reason? What's the motivation? For people to see. This is what he's taking aim at in Matthew chapter 6. Everything they do is done for people to see. He says they make their phylacteries wide, their tassels long, and they love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi or teacher by others. They have turned service into a commodity. And this is what we all struggle with. You can be generous with your money, but you can also see how there's a way to use that generosity in order to gain something for yourself. And as humans, we become experts at doing that. Picture here on the screen, this is neat. This is called the inscription of Theodotus. And this comes from the late Second Temple period. So this is contemporary to the time of Jesus and the early disciples. This is in Jerusalem. This is an inscription that was found attached to one of the early synagogues in Jerusalem. So you had people worshiping in the temple, but then you had synagogues where they would also go. And this is what the inscription says. Theodotus, son of Vetanus, priest and synagogue leader, son of a synagogue leader, grandson of a synagogue leader, rebuilt this synagogue for the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments, and the hostelry, rooms and baths for the lodging of those who have need from abroad. It was established by his forefathers, the elders, in Simonides. It's a plaque attached to a building. This guy gave the money to construct this building. Now, it's easy to be critical of that and say, oh, what was in this guy's heart? He was just doing it for praise. But this is still part of our culture very much today, is it not? If you went to a university, was there a building on your university's campus that has someone's name on a plaque on the outside? Almost every one of them does, because they rely on other people's generosity, and then the way that we praise them for that generosity is we honor them with a plaque on the building. That's probably exactly what they did then. But this is exactly what Jesus is asking us to question. And we see this all over the place. Municipal buildings, maybe the library that you frequent with your children has somebody's name attached to it because they gave a great big amount of money. Wings in hospitals. Even if you go to Disneyland, that space between Disneyland and California Adventure is filled with bricks with people's names on them. And Jesus is calling that into question. What he wants us to do is stop and question our motives. If what you are after is the plaque, then you have received your reward. If what you want is your name in stone forever so everyone knows how generous you were, that is your reward. But there's nothing else after that. Is there something better than that kind of reward? That's the question. And so, Jesus gives us some advice. This is his practical application. As we question our motives in the way that we give, he says this is what we're supposed to do. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And I want you to stop for a moment, and I want you to think about the absurdity of that suggestion. If you write a check and you're going to drop it in the contribution plate, if you hide your left hand behind your back as your right hand writes the check, have you actually accomplished anything useful? Your left hand doesn't have any idea what's going on with your right hand. Jesus is once again using an absurd illustration in order to, and I imagine the audience kind of chuckling at these illustrations as he goes along. Think back in chapter 5 when he talked about if your right eye causes you to stumble, do what? Pluck it out. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. Later on, he's going to talk about a log in an eye versus a speck in your eye. He was a master at these absurd illustrations because they drive the point home. Be so secretive in your giving that one hand doesn't even know what the other hand is doing. That's his point. And that takes a whole lot of intention. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. What if you spend your whole life in generous acts of giving and no one ever thanks you for it? What if you spend your whole life in generous acts of giving and no one ever puts a plaque up with your name on it? Are you okay with that? When you receive that reward from your Father, will it all be worth it? What is the motivation in here when we perform our righteousness in front of others? Again, Jesus isn't saying don't ever let anyone know anything you do that has to do with your righteousness. People will see it all the time. Imagine the practical application of this. Now today, what do we do when it comes time for our offering? We just put a slide on the board and then we give all that bullet list of ways that we can give, right? Most of it do it electronically today. You guys remember the old school way? What did we do? We passed the plates, right? You remember those days? First came the Lord's Supper, then separate and apart from the Lord's Supper. Remember that? Then the plates got passed. Everyone would have to be blindfolded so that no one knew what anyone was doing. Jesus is not asking us to act in ridiculous ways. He's just asking us to question our motives. Just as we saw with the interpretation of the law, the heart is what it's all about. So it is with the way that we practice our righteousness. It's all about the heart. A heart aligned with the will of our Father. If what we're really after is the praise of other people, then you'll get it. But if what you truly desire is praise from your Father, then you need to be careful in the way that you perform your righteousness in front of others. That's his advice with giving. Next week, we'll talk about praying. And Jesus does something really awesome when he gets to prayer. He gives us a model of what prayer looks like. One of, if not maybe, the most famous passage in all of Scripture, the Lord's Prayer. And we're going to spend a couple weeks talking about that. Because while our tendency, I think, in the modern church is to skip over the Lord's Prayer, there is so much depth and so much beauty there. And I want to make sure that we get to all of it. And so with that, the lesson is yours. I encourage you this week to call your own motives into question. Not your neighbors, your own motives. If you have anything you need prayers about, if you have anything you need encouragement about, if you have anything you are in need of repenting over, the invitation is yours right now. Let us know how we might serve you. Let's stand and let's sing this last song.
Jesus, you're my firm foundation. My hope in your holy